So number one, L&D people, don't let senior people play Teflon desk politics with you. That's their problem. It needs to stay on their desk, not slide off it onto yours. We need to think what's the change that we want to generate here, rather than what do we want to deliver in terms of learning or training. What is the change that we want to deliver? What are the behaviors that we want to deliver? So there's your question. And then given that someone maybe has made that change from where they were to that new behavior, how did they do that? What steps did they go through? How do you take someone through a workflow of activities so they actually do change their behavior? You have to design that roadmap.
This is how we learn now.
This episode of L&D Disrupt is brought to you by How Now, the learning platform that actually makes learning matter. Because let's face it, you could push out loads of content, track skills in a spreadsheet, drown in admin, and still not know what's working. Or you could use How Now to connect your people to the skills they need. Deliver learning in the flow of work and prove it's making a difference. That's how modern companies like Depop, Trainline, Crunchyroll, SoEnergy, TomTom, Investec, and so many more do it. Learn more at gethownow.com.
Paul, it's great to have you back on the show.
To be here.
So, we're talking about something that's quite a pressing problem that we both agree is a pressing problem. But I guess for those of you who are listening, talk to me about, what are the limits of kind of content delivery, and why is there a renewed urgency around content delivery isn't enough and we need to be thinking beyond this? Why are we talking about this today?
Well, we're still talking about it because it's been around a while. But there probably is a renewed urgency in a sense. I think it's probably because the people with the checkbook who are paying for L&D are getting a little more discerning about what they think they're getting for their money. And partly that's just budgets are tight, just across the board. There's all this idea of, well, if we're going to spend some money, what are we getting for it? So it could well be the CFO is driving some of that urgency, and L&D's having to stop and think a little more about not so much what can we teach, but what can we change? And that's a very, and of course, that's the question the CFO is interested in. If I want to spend this money, I want to see some change as a result of it.
Yeah, there's definitely, we're finding as well, there's like more of a demand and consequently a pressure on L&D to have impact, because like you said, the CFO, CEO is sitting there going, they've got FOMO because the market's moving fast, and they're like, what are we doing to innovate and compete? And they're asking L&D to go, what are you doing to drive this? So I can definitely see there probably is a renewed urgency that's coming from scrutiny. But we're looking at the data, and I've shared this stat before, and I'm sure you've seen it, but even going 2 years back, there was a survey that came out saying 400 billion spent globally on learning, yet in the same year, only 12% of people reported gaining any skills from it. And there's variance of this data to essentially demonstrate that content availability is high, but actually application and impact is low. Do you think this kind of points to just a fundamental misunderstanding of learning and learning effectiveness? Where does this come from?
I think it's almost habit. People have got into the habit of spending a bit of money on some training and then moving on without thinking about what that really means in practice. And habits are hard to break. I mean, a lot of L&D people are in what I sometimes term a fur-lined rut. They're just very comfortable doing what they're doing and not really thinking about what they should be thinking about, which is the impact. And yet, weirdly enough, if you talk to any of them and you say, what do you want to do here? Do you just want to, do you want to deliver some content, or do you want to really make an impact for the business? They'll always say, oh no, I want to make an impact. They'll never just say, I want to deliver content. And then they go back to their desk, or you follow them and sit on their shoulder and look over their, what they're doing. And all they're doing is delivering content in many cases. I mean, I don't want to tar everyone with the same brush. As you said, there's certainly a percentage of change happens. But my background's engineering, and I mean, heck, if I was designing machinery with that level of failure, I'd be killing my customers.
And
You
why
know?
do you think? And that's such a great point, Paul, because I find the same. The conversations I have with peers in L&D is it's not that they're not aware of what the right thing to do is, right? And that's what's really fascinating about this challenge. It's so we know what the right thing to do is, and we know we should be adding value and having meaningful impact on the organization, which then kind of takes me to go, so are we not doing it because it's too hard to do? Right? Have we just not been equipped with the frameworks, the mental models, the tools to be able to do this? Like, because if we know that's the right thing to do, why are we not doing it?
It's that knowing doing gap, isn't it? I mean, and it happens with us in L&D, in the sense that, as you say, I think largely people know they should be doing stuff differently. They might have some detail, like, well, I need that other model, I need this, but they're not necessarily even researching what to do. And yet there's plenty of stuff out there that you've put out, that we've put out, that a lot of others have put out in this space of learning transfer and generating impact. So it's not that the knowledge to do that's not available. But the same thing occurs when they go and deliver learning, which is a horrible phrase, but they deliver something to people and they learn a bit about it and they have a bit more knowledge and then they don't do anything with it. So it's the same knowing doing gap with the people who are going on learning programs as the learning doing gap that's there for L&D itself. And the same one that's there when I know what I should eat, but actually I still had those biscuits for with my coffee this morning. So, there's a lot of things that we know we should do but don't, both in our personal lives and elsewhere. And I think usually it's just it's a matter of being stuck in a way of doing things. As I said, habit is a big driver of that. We just keep doing kind of what we've always done. The status quo is a very seductive place to stay because there's a familiarity about it, and you almost can't get fired for keeping doing what you've always done. There's a risk to change. There's a need to tolerate discomfort with change. There's all sorts of things there that makes it a little bit scary, a little bit different, and yeah,
Yeah,
yeah. So you need that. You need something driving it, and I think there is that sort of inexorable move now towards more impact. And I think because there's more driving, there's more scrutiny, use that term, which is it's a good way to think of it. I think there's more scrutiny of what L&D is doing. And L&D is often also having to try and think, well, how do I justify my existence? How do I justify my paycheck? What can we measure to prove I'm making a difference? I'm not convinced that's the right thing to be doing in a sense. They should be measuring to improve the way they do things, not to measure to prove their paycheck's worth paying. But nevertheless, there is that desire to measure, which is coming more and more.
it's interesting because it reminds me of this great bit of research. I think it's either University of Hertfordshire or Huddersfield. I'm not too sure, but I'll put the right one in the show notes. But they found 70% of people would stick with what they're doing, even if they knew the change was guaranteed to give them a better outcome. And it was just to kind of demonstrate that even when we think no, something might give you a better result, we hate change and the inherent risk that's baked into change.
Yeah.
Um, that will stick with it. But like you were saying, Paul, what you find there is the only thing that can make people who hate change is a really big change that makes the current status quo unacceptable. And it sounds like we're getting to a point now with the scrutiny and this new pressure that's coming on L&D that the current approach is just not acceptable. Right?
Yeah.
You're going to have to move and change. Or the business is going to look at it and go, you're not adding value. And so we're going to cut this. Is that a fair assessment?
Yeah, I think so. Change is an interesting one, in the sense that some people hate change, but actually people hate being changed. They often will go and make changes for themselves. They'll go and get married, they'll move house, they'll get a new job, they'll do all sorts of things, out of almost nowhere and say, right, doing that. So it's more a matter of they don't want to be driven to change. So then the question is, how can we lead that change for L&D as a sector? How can we lead them to this new promised land of impact and wonderful things? but as you say, there's nothing stopping them moving there. And a lot of it's a mindset thing in a way, I think and it is, a simple shift in mindset. It's,
Yeah.
it's at the moment, too often they think, okay, we've got some issues around management, for example. We better do some management training. So what's the typical curriculum for a management or supervisor course? How do we stitch that together? How do we deliver it? And the whole conversation is related around content delivery, really. And very little is given and how it's going to impact that initial thought that there is a problem with the supervisory levels and things. So it's a mindset shift around, putting the horse before the cart and saying, well, how do we look at what we need to achieve? What are we trying to change? And then how do we deliver that change? Or how do we deliver those behaviors? Or how do we deliver content? As soon as you think about delivering content, you kind of, you're done. That's the end of it. You're down a blind alley. It's
Let's say I'm sitting here listening to this, and I've been an L&D team for years, and we've essentially built out a content delivery factory, and this is what we've been doing for years, is pushing it out. I'm listening to this and going, okay, it sounds like I've got to change what I'm doing, but what is the alternate? What should I be doing? So if not content delivery, what should I be doing?
Well, I'm not saying not do content delivery. It's almost always a requirement at some point along the cycle, but it's the mindset shift from I'm a content factory. We have content, we buy it in, we create it, we do, we do all this. Heck, we bought this massive library of content and from some aggregator. The question is, how do I deliver the change that the people who are promoting the organizational strategy, what change do they want in the people in the organization in order to get that strategy executed effectively and efficiently? So that starts to become my question, is how do I relate what I'm doing to the organizational strategy and its execution? How do I get closer to the business to start finding out, well, what change do they actually want? And it's also not so much what they want, but what they need, because what they want, they might come and say, I want this management course. The problem is that may well not be what they need. So that then brings you into that whole realm of performance consultancy and analysis. So L&D needs to get a lot better at analysis. They need to broaden their skill set and roles out to be thinking what changes have to occur in the business in order for that strategy to get executed well. And then how can I help people be ready to execute those changes and to do those things when they're needed? So there's also a timeline horizon you need to be thinking about. In 6 months' time, the strategy will require us to be doing this. So we better start thinking about getting people ready for that now, so that they peak in 6 months when it's needed.
So what I'm hearing there, Paul, is to go, essentially every organization has a strategy they need to deliver. And the question is, do they have the capabilities to deliver that strategy? And really your role is to make sure the organization does have the capabilities to be able to deliver that strategy and achieve those business objectives. I guess kind of going into the area of what you were talking around performance consulting, how do I get to that, right? Because quite often what we see is almost a retrofitting of learning back to a strategic objective, right? Like where the conversation of aligning strategic priorities didn't happen upfront, like you're saying it should. And instead it's like, oh, I've created this content and I've put it out there, and now I better figure out a way of retrofitting and justifying why this thing exists in the world. But if I was to do it, let's say the more kind of preferred and optimal way of aligning those priorities up front, how would you recommend I would have that conversation, L&D? What would the steps look like for me to do that?
They're relatively straightforward and simple, which is why I don't get it that people don't do it more often, in a sense, which is what we talked about earlier. Is let's assume the conversation is taking place, someone senior in the organization saying things aren't happening the way I want them to happen. So therefore, I think there's a need to work with people in some way to improve what they're doing. Often that comes across as the people are broken, please go and fix them. But we won't talk about that. That's not quite the right politically correct thing to say. But assume you're having that conversation with that senior person. the question you got to ask them is, okay, so things have got to change. That's what you want. Okay, how do you want them to change? You know, what needs to change from your perspective? If we deliver a program for you, how would you know that program was 100% successful? That's the question. You need to get through the conversation to the point where you can ask that question. Okay, yeah, we deliver programs. Programs are us. That's what we do. How would you know the program that we deliver for you on your behalf to fix the problem you're talking about is 100% successful? How would you know that? And they've got to then give you a set of, in effect, ways they would measure the success of that program.
Yeah.
What would they see? What would they hear? What would they feel? How would they know that there's been a change? That might turn up in some measures, some KPIs. That might turn up in the way they hear things around the office. That might turn up in many different ways. But how would they notice that? Now, here's a really interesting corollary question you can ask on top of that that makes them think about that in a more granular way. Okay, that's great. You've given me a definition of 100% success. That's brilliant. Now we know what utopia looks like in terms of this particular problem. What would you see if it was only 50% successful, our program? Because we know not all programs are 100% successful. If it was only 50% successful, how would you know it was 50 and not 100? And what you're forcing them to do is to think more granularly about the measures they're using within themselves to judge your program. Now, you might have your own measures for that program, but whatever you do from that point on, they are going to use their measures, idiosyncratic though they may be, to judge the success of your program. So it would behoove you to know what those damn measures are that senior person is going to use. So you always have to, and then you might need to go to other senior people and saying, we've got this program running, it's going to impact some of your people too. How would you know it's successful? And you'll end up with a whole lot of different success measures from the different senior people. That's fine. That's now telling you what they need to see in order to think you're cool and a real success as an L&D person. Because if
I
you
love
don't
that.
meet those measures that they have, there's no measures you could produce that'll convince them otherwise.
I love that, Paul, because it does two things. One is creates that kind of alignment, but also often the challenge I hear from L&D folks I speak to is a challenge to get buy-in. And this constructive conversation, talking about metrics they care about, sounds like a very compelling way to get buy-in. Because if I'm telling you as a business stakeholder, I care about this metric, and I'm able to come back to you to say, actually, I can do A, B, and C, that's going to contribute to moving that metric for you. Then that's how you start to have that buy-in conversation, which kind of puts me to, going back to why isn't this happening more commonly, right? Like, and again, it's not to say I definitely come across L&D professionals who are doing this and advocating for this, but I also come across a lot more who aren't doing this or want to do this and don't know how. And sometimes one of the things I see when it's not happening is the function is typically quite siloed, right? Where L&D is kind of operating in its own lane, coming up with problems to solve and content to put out there. And there isn't as much interaction or discussion with the wider business as there needs to be. It reminds me of almost this parallel when you're building a product, where if you're building a product without speaking to your customer or your end users, it just increases the risk of building something no one wants. And I almost feel like there's an element of that happening. Would you say that's fair?
Up to a point, yes. I think it's the senior people are busy. They just want to get it off their plate. There's a problem. If I can, I've got a Teflon desk, I hope, and I'm going to get rid of it to somebody else real fast, slide it off the edge there to L&D, and they can deal with my problem. So number one, L&D people, don't let senior people play Teflon desk politics with you. That's their problem. It needs to stay on their desk, not slide off it onto yours. Now, you can help them work with that problem and solve it. But I think also they need to be reminded of what that problem's costing the organization in order for them to get serious about having that conversation with you. Because that's kind of what you were just talking about, is how do you have that conversation? How do you generate a rich enough conversation and convince that senior person they've got to stay in that conversation long enough to get some benefit out of it? And I think that's the cost of inaction, or the COI, as it's often called, is you got to ask them, if you don't touch this problem, not if we, but if you, senior person, don't touch this problem and deal with it in the next 6 months, what's it going to cost the organization? And they won't be able to give you an answer to that. It's very rare they can. So what you've got to do is then help them narrow in on something. Well, is it going to cost £10,000? Well, no, a lot more than that. Okay, is it going to cost 1 million? Probably not. Okay, 500,000. Yeah. Okay, 750. Bracket them to get to a point where you say, okay, it's going to be just over 500,000 if we don't touch this problem in the next 6 months. By the way, don't use 12 months. It's too long. They can't think that far. Just 6 months is enough. In other words, 12 months is more than 500,000. It's, more than double probably. But if you go for 6, you'll get they'll be more easily for them to think about what that might cost. Now that's really rough and they might be very wrong, but what you've done is you've kind of put a stake in the sand of what the cost of inaction is, which means now you can say, well, hang on a minute, if we solve this problem within the next 6 months for that amount of money, we've kind of broken even here. That's got to concentrate their mind somewhat. And if all they can say, well, it's going to cost 10,000, you can say, well, I got other people with other problems way more valuable than yours. Bye.
Yeah.
They've got to bid for L&D time in a sense, almost, with the cost of inaction against the problems they've currently got.
Yeah, I'm a big advocate for cost of inaction, because I often find L&D teams get stuck at the point of building a business case and talking about ROI. And ROI is a difficult thing to talk about, especially if you haven't built the infrastructure and the data points to be able to extrapolate and tell that story. But like you said, the cost of inaction quite often means we're just looking at the historic data of things that are costing us money and affecting the business. And so it's much, much easier to say, we've got a whole bunch of people who are leaving the business because they feel unsupported in their growth. The missed opportunity, the replacement cost and recruitment cost is going to be X. And quite often your learning initiative is going to be a fraction of that cost of X. And now it's up to them to go. And I find typically in an environment where you've got tight economic conditions, people often make decisions on the back of loss aversion, right? They're more likely to be sad about losing £1,000 than they are to be happy about gaining £1,000. And so if you're talking about cost of inaction and losing money, I think it typically tends to resonate better in a tighter economic environment. So I can definitely see that.
Yeah. Well, I mean, it's just motivational theory. We will always move away from a fire rather more quickly than we'll move towards the light or something special. And then the other thing to bring into play there is the value discounting that people do with the cost of inaction is a current, real, clear and present danger. Whereas an ROI is some point out in the future, and we tend to discount future benefits quite heavily if they're out in the future. So again, this difference against loss aversion that you talked about. It's a very strong. So it's always worth trying to use away from motivation if you can to get people to do stuff.
Yeah. And I just want to move this to, I guess we're talking the upfront discovery and consulting work that you would do to kind of understand where the business problems are. Just looking at kind of learning transfer, and let's say we've now come up with the programs and content. Quite often it's again after the fact that people think about learning transfer. But I know I've heard you say before and read where we suggest that's not the way to do it. So how should I be, and just for the purpose of anyone who's, we have a lot of people who are new to L&D who listen to the podcast as well. What is learning transfer for? How should I be thinking about learning transfer?
Well, learning transfer is just simply making sure that if you are delivering training, knowledge, skills, whatever, in some kind of L&D initiative, that it gets operationalized effectively out in the business in some way that's useful to the business. So it's not really transfer of learning. It's really making sure that whatever learning they do is operationalized effectively and it's useful learning for the business. But in order to make that happen, you've got to put a wrapper around whatever learning initiative you do, whether that's a training course or a bit of e-learning or whatever. You need this wrapper around it, both pre and afterwards. And the real I mean, to come back to your comment, people often try and think, well, I've done a training course. Now, what do I have to do to make it stick? It's too late by then. I mean, don't start reading a book at chapter 3. It makes no sense. And that's what people are doing when they do that. They've missed all the first bit. They start at chapter 3, they finish at chapter 7 when there's actually 10 chapters in the book. Nobody does that when they're reading a book. Don't do it when you're doing a training thing. So right from the beginning, you have to start with the end in mind. That, we've all talked about that for many years since well, it's been around since Socrates' day, quite frankly, that thinking. We need to think, what's the change that we want to generate here, rather than what do we want to deliver in terms of learning or training. What is the change that we want to deliver? And in order for that change to happen, people are going to have to do things differently. So what are the doing things differently? What are the behaviors that we want to deliver? So there's your question. How do we deliver those behaviors is the question. And then you start thinking, well, how do we work with the business to define measures to understand when we have delivered those behaviors and that they're getting the change they want? And then given that someone maybe has made that change from where they were to that new behavior, how did they do that? What steps did they go through? How do you take someone through a workflow of activities so they actually do change their behavior? It's never going to happen overnight. There's very few sort of road to Damascus conversions sort of in the classroom or whatever. So there's always going to be a sequence of activities over time that leads to behavior change, that leads to change and impact. So you have to design that roadmap. And one of the analogies I sometimes use is a sat-nav one. There's 4 critical success factors for a sat-nav, and they're the same 4 for a learning program. You've got to know where you are now. Sat-navs can't do anything unless it knows where you are. And from a learning perspective, we've got to know behaviorally, where are we now? What are people doing right now? What's their current location behaviorally? What is the future location we want them to be at behaviorally? What's our sat nav? You've got to know where you want to go. How are they going to step by step, turn by turn, get from point A to point B? How are they going to make that behavioral journey from what they're doing now to what we want them to do instead? How do we help them cross that behavioral gap? What are all the things they need to do? Some of that will be consuming some content, but a lot of it won't. It'll be other stuff. And then how do we monitor and track keeping them online and doing that journey, those activities, those turn-by-turn instructions, and nudge them back onto the journey, onto the path if they stray from it, which is what the sat-nav does for you. If you take a wrong turn, it'll gently guide you back onto the path. So those 4 things are required for your learning program to be successful.
I love that analogy, Paul. And I also love how powerful it is when you just ask the right question. Even reframing the question from what content does the business need to what change does the business need, it almost lends itself to driving everything else follows suit.
Oh,
right?
it does.
Yeah.
It's just that one simple change, rather than what do we want to teach, what do we want to change?
Yeah. I love that. I feel like that needs to be on the walls of every office and every bedroom where there's an L&D person working. And it kind of, I remember, I read this somewhere where you wrote this, or I may have even heard you say it in a talk, but I really, really liked it. It's something along the lines of kind of, if learning isn't kind of changing behavior or decisions, then it's not learning, it's entertainment. And I think it goes back to really asking that core question of, if you're just pushing out content and you want it to be quote unquote fun and interactive, it's just entertainment, but don't expect there to be any performance improvements or behavior change around it. And what I want to bring to is kind of what this points towards is almost a new role for L&D, right? Almost L&D asking some real deep introspective questions around what is my role versus what I've been doing now, and what does it look like? And sometimes I hear from L&D teams who are trying to change this. They're trying to change what L&D stands for in their organization, but they find it hard to change the perception that the business has, right? Like quite often, not just your senior stakeholders, but even people coming into the business, like your new grads and people who've been there for years, they're so conditioned to think that learning looks 2 ways. It's either in a classroom or you're clicking an e-learning. And so to change that is where they struggle. Like, do you see that? And is there any kind of best practices you've seen around how to change that perception?
What flicked into my head really was this whole brand of L&D. Who are they, and what's the value proposition of L&D? I've worked with some teams, L&D teams, where we work them through a value proposition. We're saying, well, who are you and what's your value to this customer of yours called the business? What can you create and wrap up and package in a way that they're prepared to buy and love to buy? So that's another way to think about L&D, is how can it sort out that? But you've got then the brand of L&D. And quite honestly, the brand of L&D in most organizations is not that great. And you can tell a little bit about what your brand is by just noticing what they come and ask for, because that's what they think you do. And that's almost always going to be quite a limited number of things. And I'm sure for most L&D people, there will be a lot of things they'd like to be asked for, but are never asked for, that they could do and serve if they. So the question is, well, how can you create a brand that people want to interact with? What's the promise of that brand? And if they understand and like the promise, they'll come every time because they'll want what you've got to offer. But then, of course, you have to step up at the touch points you have with them so that your reputation doesn't go down the tubes. Because, of course, your reputation has a big impact on the brand perception. So those two things kind of, rock together. So, yeah, it's all about brand. I sometimes call the brand L&D the fourth elephant in the L&D room, is that there's three others. And that's one, the sneaky one, that's actually people often completely forget about. And whenever I see an L&D strategy, and I see quite a few of them, if I don't see something in there about promoting and generating a worthwhile brand promise for L&D to the rest of the organization, I say, hang on, there's a chunk missing out of your L&D strategy that absolutely has got to be in there.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it goes back to, again, the analogy you were talking about in terms of building a product and taking it to market, and that market for you is your internal audiences. And the build and they will come definitely doesn't happen. And I think quite often and I also think it's about speaking the language the internal customer understands. And I still too often see, hey, we've got a new platform, or hey, we've got a gazillion courses. And you might be excited by that as the L&D person, but the what's in it for me, for those people you're speaking to, isn't there. And like you say, I often ask people who are not in L&D, like friends of mine who are working in other domains. I was like, oh, well, what's your company's L&D like, right? And that's always a surefire way of seeing what that brand perception is. And for most people, when I ask that question, their association with L&D is very much, oh yeah, they chase me once in a while to get something done, and I've got to look at this e-learning, and again, that's it. That's as far as their perception of L&D done. And you realize someone who has that perception of their internal L&D is never really going to see you as a viable solution to a business problem they have, right? They're never going to come to you with a business problem. Paul, I could go on and on with you, and that's why we've had you back on the show so many times. But I do want to kind of close off with, I guess, looking at actionable takeaways. So, if I'm a learning leader or a learning professional listening to this right now, what's that one thing I should stop doing right away? And what's that one thing I should start doing right away?
I think it's more about what you should start doing, which is ask that question. What change do I need to help encourage here? It's not so much what change do I need to make, because that's often beyond your purview. It's too big a thing, but a change is required. Some senior person is asking for a change. How can I help that senior person make that change? And if I talk with them about making that change, then that'll change everything.
Paul, it's been an absolute pleasure. It always is. Look forward to having you back on the show again.
Absolutely. All right. No, I'd love to come back. It's always good to talk to you, Nelson.
This episode of L&D Disrupt is brought to you by How Now, the learning platform that actually makes learning matter. Because let's face it, you could push out loads of content, track skills in a spreadsheet, drown in admin, and still not know what's working. Or you could use How Now to connect your people to the skills they need. Deliver learning in the flow of work and prove it's making a difference. That's how modern companies like Depop, Trainline, Crunchyroll, SoEnergy, TomTom, Investec and so many more do it. Learn more at gethownow.com.